So let's continue on. As we've seen, Griffin says HR, human rights, are seen, in his view, as protectors of normative agency, this ability that we have to make norms, like to talk about the you should, our agency, not in just terms of things we can do, but agency in terms of things that we should do. Um, and again, he's looking and taking from history, so he wants to look at the historical notion of HR. We did a little history, how it was eventually, or sorry, how it started in a theological context, then it was drained of all that theology, secularized, and you get this sort of some people call it a humanist version, or a rationalist, or a secular version of human rights. And this sort of historical approach that Griffin uses, and again, he doesn't want to just take the history, but he wants to build on the history. So he's looking at the history and trying to build on it. This he calls it, this is an empirical, and he does in fact refer to it as a bottom-up approach, right? He's not coming in with a preconceived notion, just looking at what people said. Now, of course, philosophers, some have embraced that. I mentioned that John Locke, in his great work, the Essay on Human Understanding, takes a historical approach to concepts. So that's that's hundreds of years old, that method. But other methods are equally old. And you find that other ways of trying to ground or talk about human rights is one that Griffin points out is roughly embraced by Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mills, and John Rawls. So, from the Enlightenment to the 19th century to the 20th century, the idea of grounding HR, you don't look at necessarily going at a history of a concept. Rather, you derive the notion or the idea of human rights from some kind of abstract moral principle, like a moral law or a principle of utility, or Rawls has certain kinds of principles that he has in his theory of ethics, and things flow out of that. So it's much more of an inferential type structure, that you start with something very abstract, very top, like it's sort of like a top-down approach, right? Opposite to what Griffin's doing. Top-down, abstract moral principle, do some logical maneuvering, and then bang, out comes a notion of human rights. So the idea of human rights is something that is derived, right? Remember, even in the medievals, you didn't derive it. It was something that was immediately seen, even though it might have been rooted ultimately in God. It was something you did see. You didn't really derive morality in that way. Okay, Griffin says, okay, I could do this. He said, I think there's problems with this, but why don't I just make a better derivation? And Griffin says, well, he says a lot of things, but one thing he does stress is that, well, this whole methodology of this top-down approach, he thinks that the derived human rights, whatever you do in this approach, it has a very different extension, a different kind of domain of application. And I think also he doesn't really quite say it, but I think he means also that it has a different intention. You're going to get something really different if you say, okay, here's this concept of human rights, I'm going to derive it. You're going to end up with a very different concept of human rights that maybe people won't really recognize. And this does happen in the tradition of philosophy, where philosophers will say, oh, I'm looking at an everyday concept, and then once they do their work on it, and they say, well, here, it flows out of this higher order concept, and I will derive it from that. What they derive sometimes is not something the average person would recognize. You can think of a good example of that actually does go back to Locke, when people started analyzing the concept of personal identity, right? And sometimes when people would use a very abstract analysis and start at something very high and abstract and then try to get the notion of personal identity out of that, they come up with a notion of personal identity that the average person would say, I don't really recognize what you're talking about. So that's what Griffin thinks, is that he says extension, but I think what he's really meaning is that this top-down methodology will lead us to something that most of us just won't really recognize. And he says, no, I want to keep the historical notion of human rights, that idea. It's indeterminate, yeah, it's got its problems, but I want to keep it, and I want to improve it. I don't want to run the risk of losing it by employing a methodology that is top-down. So, okay, so another name that he brings up is Alan Gewirth, very important moral thinker. Alan Gewirth, has a similar project, but Griffin wants to distance or to show the distance between the two. Alan Gewirth, it also has kind of an abstract formulation and a top-down method, but he also ends up with that human rights, they have a logical necessity to them. Like they can't really, to simplify Gewirth's argument enormously. Gewirth, in part of his argument, is that human rights really cannot be denied without pain of contradiction. So that if you want to deny a human right, you're guilty of some logical error, right? So in that sense, you may ignore them, of course, and violate them and whatnot. But basically, human rights cannot be consistently denied. They in a logical framework because they have a logical necessity. And Griffin wants to pull away from that because his notion of human rights as protectors of normative agency, which I've labeled with a little asterisk, that understanding does not hold that human rights have a logical necessity. Right? He's not saying that. He's not saying that, to deny human rights as protectors of normative agency is to commit some sort of logical error. He's not saying that. He's saying you could do that because he said you could approach human rights in a different way. That's not necessarily this way, but that is kind of related to the more to the human condition, whereas this is more of an abstract one. For instance, instead of looking at them as protectors of normative agency, maybe human rights could be protectors or guardians of human need, right? So not necessarily moral agency, but human needs. And some scholars have looked at human rights in the context of needs. And in some ways, Aristotle is sort of close to that because, what do you need to flourish? What do you need for a good and happy life? So that's what makes it really important. But of course, it's not a logical inconsistency if you deny a human life. I mean, that's a terrible thing to do, but it's not logically inconsistent. So that too would be not logically necessary as well. So those are different possibilities. But this one, looking at human rights as maybe protectors of protectors of human needs, is closer to Griffin's projects than let's say the project of Gewirth and Continental Rawls. So there are closer and further away projects to Griffin's. This one's a little closer, but he thinks that's not the way to go. He still thinks that the best way to go, the best way to understand human rights will be in terms of this protectors of normative agency, and that will fit best with our best ethics. Remember that. Try to keep the forest because we're kind of going into the trees here, but remember, he's trying to come up with the idea to flesh out the idea of human rights as protectors of normative agency, and that's the best way to think of human rights, and that will work in our best ethics. So thinking of human rights of human needs, maybe you could do that, but that's not the way our man Griffin is going to go. And he also says kind of a little bit of a shot against the Continental Rawls gang is that these guys were not really trying to found human rights. They were commandeering this and pressing it into the service of their ethical programs. And that's not what he's trying to do. He thinks that we can do better than that. And again, while staying closer to the ethical ideal of a human right. Okay, now, but ultimately he thinks that this idea of a human right that came to us secularized through the Enlightenment, through history. Okay, so it originally has its theological context, comes through the Enlightenment, and it is detheologized, secularized. He likes this idea as the problems notwithstanding, the indeterminateness as he keeps going on about, notwithstanding, he still thinks it's a good idea that we should improve on, not try to go in different tracks or whatever. And he still thinks that seeing it as this protector of normative agency, let's stick with that. Let's improve that. Why? Because this way of seeing it has been a very powerful idea and has done a lot of good. So he thinks that, its consequences speak in favor of it, that it's done a lot of good. It's powerful in our political life. It's also been key in connection with notions of human dignity, right? So our moral normative agency is connected and linked up with the powerful idea of human dignity. And the derivational approach, and again, you're in danger of losing all that good stuff, right? If you go off on this tangent, the logic may lead you somewhere else. So he thinks that historically we've got a good idea of human rights. Let's work with that, not try to do any fancy logical maneuvering here, because we might lose the good stuff that we already have. And we end up with a different, it may not be horrible, but we'll end up with a different concept of human rights. Now, Griffin admits, though, that remember, he's got a bottom-up approach, right? It's going to have to eventually, it will have to raise up a bit. What does he mean by that? It's going to become a little more abstract, because it's not just a laundry list of what people have said about this category, right? That's not going to work very well. We want a little bit more. Like when you can think of it in this sense. Like if I ask you about the intention of a concept, and you just give me a laundry list of what people have said, that's going to be a little bit unsatisfactory. So I'm going to say, well, okay, what's in common with what everybody said? That's a little bit of a jump, a little bit of an abstraction. And remember, to abstract means you're taking some, but you're leaving some behind. So what's the really important thing that's common to what? It may not be the only thing that's common, but what's a really key important thing that's common in this historical investigation? So even the bottom-up approach, Griffin says, yeah, I'm going to get somewhat abstract. And he says, as the top-down approach, tries to come up with something more particular through its logical inferences, the bottom-up approach, as it tries to, find out what's common to things, will have to become a little more abstract. He said, will it sort of meet? He says, well, we'll find out in the context of the book. He doesn't seem very hopeful at this part. So will eventually we get, like he says, something like, if we keep in this abstractive process on the bottom-up approach, will we eventually reach kind of like a Kantian categorical imperative or a Millsian principle of utility? Those were their, shall we say, their abstract anchors of their views. He said, well, let's wait and see. But he doesn't sound too optimistic about that. But he at least admits that he's not trying, again, to derive. Griffin is not trying to derive human results from normative agency, just seeing them as protectors of human normative agency. And he thinks this is the best way to understand them, and the historical approach is the best way. All right. Okay, now, as a last bit, he says, okay, what about a totally different way? Like, I've been talking so far, says Griffin, about philosophers, right, and their normative approach and all this. What about a different approach to human rights? What about this one here about human rights? Let's say human rights simply in terms of this. So human rights simply in terms of international law. What about that angle? Why don't we just go with that? Lots of people do, right? The UDHR, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Why not just go along those lines, right? Why not just work with international lawyers and judges and things like that, and let them determine what's going on with human rights? Why don't we do that? Now, Griffin doesn't say that that's an absolutely wrong thing, but he doesn't think that's the best way to go. He's got sort of a little bit more nuanced of a position, but he is critical of it, and we'll turn to that in the next video.